The first story I'm going to talk about is probably one of the weirdest of all. It relates to the story of the Dead Sea Scrolls. And the Dead Sea Scrolls were found at a place called Qumran on the Dead Sea in 1947. And they're basically a huge collection of documentation. That's actually a photograph of one of the original scrolls. And they're kind of like the earliest written documentation from the Old Testament. And they're on public display now in Jerusalem. Anybody can go there and see them. But there's a weird story about the Dead Sea Scrolls and none other than the CIA, which in a roundabout way then sort of goes over to New Mexico and the top secret White Sands missile range, or the White Sands Proving Ground as it used to be called. But the story itself goes back to a man named Miles Copeland. And Miles Copeland, in the post-Second World War period, became a very high senior officer within the CIA. And he ran the agency's Damascus office, which was based in the American Embassy. And Copeland told this particular story about how one day in 1947, he was sort of hard at work, just analysing the sorts of secret data that the CIA does every day. And he said there was a knock on the door, and one of the personnel said, "There's somebody here who wants to see you." And he was like, "Well, who is it?" And they're like, "Well, we don't know, but he's asking for you." And so the guy was led in, and he was sort of a mysterious character. He had sort of this long flowing sort of Bedouin type outfit on, and came in sort of very clandestine and secretive way, and pulled out from inside his clothing this huge pile of parchments like that. But instead of being sort of page on page, they were all carefully fixed together, so it kind of opened up into one long piece of paper, if you like. And Copeland, of course, not being an expert in ancient languages, said, "Well, what is it? What am I looking at?" And the guy said, "Well, I found it, and I want somebody to analyse it." But there seems to have been more to this guy, whoever he was, that he wasn't just some innocent person who found this scroll, that he was maybe someone who had a reason for being there and wanting to give it to the CIA. And Copeland said, "Well, I'm not an expert in ancient languages, but I know a man who is." And this was a guy named Kermit Roosevelt, who also worked with the CIA. And so he transferred all this material to Roosevelt, took pictures of it, sent the photographs and the negatives and the original parchments. And from there, they were sent to the CIA's headquarters. Now, Copeland never got an official response from headquarters and the people above him as to what the reasoning was, why the CIA held on to this particular scroll. But he did hear rumours back that pretty much the entire text was related to a very, very ancient version of the book of Daniel. And specifically, it was a section of the book that was talking about all prophetic dreams and foreseeing the future and things like this. Now, this actually ties in with the CIA actually taking an interest in that sort of stuff in the late 40s and early 50s onwards. It later evolved into something called the remote viewing program. The idea was that the CIA tried to train its agents to sort of psychically spy on the Russians. In other words, instead of having to sort of hang around outside the Russian embassy with bugging devices, they tried to train their personnel to sort of project their mind or their soul, if you like, into the heart of the Kremlin and spy on the Russians that way. And they did a lot of early research into ancient books and manuscripts to try and determine how sort of 15th and 16th century wizards and people like this and alchemists possess these powers, and could they develop them for espionage purposes. And so it looks to be the case that this may be why they hung on to this particular scroll, because of all these different, I guess I wouldn't say magical, but kind of the typical things they were talking about in this particular book. And Copeland said, it was all taken very sort of seriously, but clandestinely, which he couldn't understand because, like most people, he thought, well, we're the CIA, we're an intelligence gathering agency. We're not in the business of simply collecting and analysing old archaeological texts. So that's what made him think there was something more to this that he wasn't seeing the fuller picture of. Now from there it kind of jumps to the White Sands missile range, which is in New Mexico. Can everybody see that all right? I don't know if it's probably just the light from where I'm standing. But the White Sands missile range, back in the 1940s, it was called the White Sands Proving Ground. And you can see all those huge mountains there. Well, behind there is where a lot of top secret research and testing of various classified aircraft is undertaken from. It was kind of like a 1940s equivalent of Area 51. And it wasn't too far from there where the atomic bomb was developed, the Manhattan Project as it was called at the time. But there's a very weird story which surfaced in the 1980s and 1990s to a number of UFO researchers, which came from insider sources in the government, who said that in 1947 some sort of UFO crashed somewhere on the White Sands missile range and was recovered by the US military, who initially thought, well, is it one of our secret test devices that we don't know about, that somebody else in the country's tested and just crashed here? That turned out not to be the case when they got inside it and reportedly found these strange, mangled little 3-foot-tall bodies, just sort of pummeled in the crash. But they reportedly also found what looked like examples of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So this is, a very sort of weird and strange story where not only was the CIA involved in the discovery and basically confiscation of a Dead Sea Scroll in Damascus, which that part of the story has now been verified, but in the time frame, exact same time frame, they were reportedly analysing a similar type scroll found in a crashed UFO at White Sands. Now, the story from there is that it was supposedly sent to code breakers and people who could decipher ancient languages, and they came to the conclusion that they're only able to decipher parts of it because they believed it was an even older language than was believed to have existed in terms of when written language actually began. So that appears at least to be when the US government's interest in sort of mystical relics and ancient artifacts kicked off in 1947, which is kind of interesting because that was the year in which the term flying saucer was created, when a pilot named Kenneth Arnold had this profound UFO encounter in Washington State in June of that year. So you have the Dead Sea Scrolls found in 47, reportedly a scroll found in a crashed UFO at White Sands, and the ushering in of the era of the flying saucer, all in the same time frame. So again, this has led certain people, even within government, to think, that maybe there's some sort of connection and tie-in with all these different phenomena.